Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, editor at Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilberg, and tonight we will be examining the role of CARICOM and how it addresses the dependence of its members on fossil fuels. To provide us with insightful perspectives as well as the facts on this matter is a distinguished guest, Dr. Devon Gardner. He's the program manager for CARICOM's Energy Unit. Sir, welcome to our studio and thanks for making the time for us this evening.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Okay, so we have about an hour for tonight's discussion, and so I'll cut to the chase. CARICOM in 2017 launched the Regional Building Energy Efficiency Project with the aim of having a code adopted to reduce dependence on fossil fuels among member states. Can you give us some insight onto what this project is really all about, why it was started, and perhaps who's responsible for implementing it, and what you've achieved thus far with it?
Sure, no problem. Well, one of the things is that energy efficiency is the single principle that is common to all CARICOM member states. Whether you are an oil-rich country like Trinidad and Tobago and nowadays Guyana, whether you are geothermal rich, whether you are oil dependent and are importing oil, whatever your means of energy, we can all produce and use the energy that we are requiring to function in ways that are more efficient. Buildings account for 80% of the energy use in most countries. So we figure that a place that we could attack the energy efficiency potential is really to focus on buildings. So what we have been looking at under the BEEP as we call it, the Building Efficient Energy Use Project, is to figure out how we can develop principles and practices and codes that function from the design of the building to the way in which energy is used in the building. So we started by looking at an energy efficiency building code, what we call the Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. We convened what we call a regional team of experts, standards officials, engineers, construction personnel, you name it, energy experts, and we brought them all together from all 15 countries. And we had them working for over a 1 year period to come up with what an energy efficiency building code for CARICOM could look like in terms of the different characteristics that it need to prescribe. And we came up with a code that was an adoption of an international code called the IECC, which is the International Energy Conservation Code for 2018 at the time, which we adopted. And then we developed an application document to that code to speak to which aspects of the code would be applied in the sense of CARICOM. So the code spoke to the orientation of the building in respect to landscape to make sure that you get natural lighting as much as possible, ventilation that was natural as much as possible, things like high vaulted ceilings and so on. It spoke to ventilation and air conditioning due to equipment, air conditioning equipment and so on. It spoke to the use of efficient lighting, where you use lighting devices. It spoke to the use of some amount of solar and other types of renewable energy to produce some amount of the energy involved inside the buildings, and many other issues. It spoke to issues related to building material to insulate against heat coming in from outside that would keep inside of the building cool and so on. So it addressed quite a number of areas of a building's, what we call a building envelope that are necessary for the building to use energy much more efficiently. The code was adopted by energy ministers in April 2018. We had finalized the code in around February 2018. The ministers adopted it as a regional code in 2018 of April. Since that, we have been doing work with countries to seek to implement the code at country levels, because each country is required to adopt the code at national level. So what we have been doing so far is helping the country, first of all, sensitizing the countries on the code to identify how the code will be implemented in the countries based on the country laws related to building permits and building planning and design. Figure out how it is that we build the competence in the country in respect to those who are responsible for designing buildings, constructing buildings, and even those who are approving buildings, so that in a sense they are able to implement the code where necessary, and of course to check for the compliance of building designs with the code. So we have not, to the extent we are not where we are or where we wanted to be. because we did have some setbacks because of the pandemic, naturally. If we got a code adopted in 2018, by the time we would have started building out the implementation program, it would have been 2019. And so a year would not have been enough. We were interrupted in March last year. But there are already 3 countries in the region that have already adopted the code. And there are another 5 that have indicated their interest in adopting the code. Guyana is one of the countries that have also indicated that it will adopt the code. It has not yet been adopted in Guyana. But we are working with countries developing national roadmaps to support their implementation. We have been doing trainings. We are now building out a program in universities to ensure that the code requirements are contained in mechanical engineering, in electrical engineering, in architecture and urban planning courses, so that people who are studying in universities will now know what the requirements of the code are. And of course, we are doing lifelong learning programs for those who are already working in the field to be able to help them to understand how to implement the code.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I believe CARICOM has been moving with a project that was launched, I believe, last year in January, and that also hit a snag when COVID hit. I believe that project has restarted?
Yes. So the view is that, we shouldn't only talk, but we should walk the talk. The Secretariat made a decision that given that we are promoting efficient energy use in buildings, that we need to look at opportunities through which we can also do that. And of course, where possible, utilize renewable energy sources too as part of what we promote. So we had started to identify opportunities where we could become more green in our energy use in the building. Since 2016, we did what we call an energy audit, where we look for where the opportunities were to become more efficient or to provide some of our energy through renewable options. And by 2017, we were able to get funding from the Japanese government to support us being able to implement some of the requirements that came out from the audit. And by 2018, we got to the stage where the Japanese Parliament approved the funding. We were able to have the grant agreement signed by the government of Guyana, because the funds came through the government of Guyana, of course, as a contribution to the Secretariat, because Japanese provides funds bilaterally through governments. And by January 2019, we were able to put out a bid tender for and select a contractor to implement the project. And in 2020, January, in fact, we were able to launch a project. But of course, we started construction in February 2020, and you know what happened in March 2020.
Yes.
So after only a month of implementation, we had to suspend the project in April 2020, because naturally construction is one of those areas where there is a lot of interactions required, and COVID was one of those where you do not want people interacting. There was a lot of uncertainty around how COVID was contracted and managed at that time. So many of the personnel working on the project were expatriates, because of the fact that the contractors involved, the main contractors are Japanese companies, Mitsubishi Corporation and Takioka Engineering. Of course, there are local subcontractors who work along with them, but the movement in and out of the country also poses challenges. The movement between regions, because the local subcontractor is from New Amsterdam, was also a challenge. So we thought that it was best to suspend the construction, given all the challenges. There was a 6 p.m. curfew and all of those things. We, of course, continue to monitor the situation. We had agreed at the time that we would resume whenever the circumstances allowed for us to reopen the construction in a safe manner. And we tracked it for over a year. We continually worked with the Ministry of Health through the CMO, the Chief Medical Officer's office, to determine, what would be required for us to open safely. We looked at international protocols around safe reopening of construction sites. We adopted the OSHA standards for construction safety during the COVID-19 pandemic. We looked at how we could also utilize aspects of the PAHO, which is the Pan American Health Organization standards for construction, and we used also obviously the national COVID-19 guidelines of Guyana, and we working with the Chief Medical Officer of Guyana, we got to the place where we were able to determine that it was safe to open the construction back this year. And so since May, of this year, we started to do some amount of resumption works, really to inspect and to understand what would be required for us to restart. And since the 1st of June, we have restarted construction fully. And as we speak, we are in the process of civil works related to the project. The project is for the installation of 400 kilowatts of solar photovoltaic power, as well as what we would say is about 2 hours of battery storage. We would say an 800 kilowatt hour system of battery. Those are the main components of that project. And of course, there is what we call an advanced building energy management system, which has automated air conditioning controls and lighting controls. So you would be able to turn off and manage air conditioning from a cell phone portal. Those who have responsibility for facilities management, you would have occupancy sensors that would be able to change and vary air conditioning settings based on the occupancy of the building and so on. So many things that would allow you to become more efficient in how the building uses energy, especially because air conditioning accounts for probably up to 80% of the building's consumption. So that's quite a lot of what we are doing, and we expect that when the project is completed, that the system will interact with the GPL grid, and of course the opportunity to export power will be there. And we are working with GPL, in fact, through another project where we are supporting the interconnection of customers through the policy requirements to so do, through what we call a net metering or a net billing arrangement. We are trying to work through with government now through a technical assistance package to understand how that would be framed for customers to be able to access and benefit from interconnection to the net, to the grid, where they can have bidirectional flow of power, either from the grid to their homes or from their homes to the grid.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to the Regional Building Energy Efficiency Project. Is there a timeline that CARICOM is looking at to have its member states be more efficient in the use of electricity or fossil fuels?
Well, that's the truth is that in terms of energy efficient use of any energy source at all, not just fossil, even renewable energy must be used efficiently, because even though the source itself is typically available for free, the technology to capture the energy from that source is not for free, and so you have to invest in the technology. So we encourage that you use all energy sources, whether it's renewable or non-renewable, in an efficient manner. The fact is that there is no deadline in terms of people or countries using energy efficiently. But we do have some targets that we have set. We, for instance, have set a target that collectively countries should improve their energy intensity by 33% compared to their 2012 level. So if we were to think about it, what we are saying is that countries should become probably 50% more efficient than in 2027 than where they were in 2012. That's a target that we have set collectively. We are working with countries to understand where the specific areas of the efficiency could come from, because in different countries it would be different. Some countries are more tourism intensive, some are more commodity intensive, and so what would generate the efficiencies and the energy savings would be different from country to country. In some countries it's the industrial sector, in some countries it's the hotel and tourism sector, in some countries it's the residential sector. We recently did some studies for every single country, looking into each sector to understand where the efficiency gains could be made. We developed a regional energy efficiency strategy that guides and orientates countries in terms of where to look and what kind of activities they could implement to get those savings, and what those activities could look like, and when you aggregate those activities, how much savings you could realize, and how those savings could be rolled up nationally to give you the 33% which we want to get at a regional level. So we look at it sector by sector, country by country, to figure out how these should be done. And the Energy Efficiency Building Code, in fact, is one of the things that is promoted under the strategy, because we could get up to 40% improvement in how we use energy if it is that we implement the Energy Efficiency Building Code. And so we are working with countries to identify specific areas. Electric vehicles is another area that we think is also important in energy efficiency, and we are pushing that through a regional electric vehicle strategy and supporting countries to understand the opportunities there. And we are also working together with our international partners on air conditioning, to look at efficient air conditioning standards that can limit or remove what we could call the underperforming air conditioning products from markets, so that the air conditioning products that come into the market, without being more expensive, are really the most efficient ones. Because if we're not careful, a lot of countries which are now applying very stringent standards in their own jurisdictions could end up dumping their products on us. Likewise for lighting, we are looking at efficient lighting too, and an efficient lighting program is actually being developed as we speak. And if CARICOM has its way, and CARICOM meaning not just the Secretariat but the member states, based on the discussions which we've had at energy ministers level, incandescent lighting would be phased out within the next year or two.
Okay. So, but for the 33% that you're looking at, there's no specific timeline to say within this decade?
By 2027.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So using the 2012 as the baseline, by 2027 we should achieve 33% improvements.
Okay, and that's across the board?
Across all CARICOM countries and across the board, yes. So
And
what the
with what
strategy
you're
is doing,
seeing-
the strategy is looking at the specific options that the country would have, so we can give them scenarios and pathways to achieve their contributions to that 33%.
Do you think that is, I'll switch gears for a bit now, do you think that's still possible in light of the unprecedented effects of COVID-19 on the economies of many of the CARICOM states?
Actually, I think it's more possible now with the impact of COVID, because
Okay.
when you think about it, one of the things that COVID did was it started to put a lot of people indoors at home. A lot of people started working from home. A lot of people were spending more time in buildings at home and in their personal space. And in that regard, people started to understand some of the importance of things that energy efficient buildings could do, like indoor air quality, which is a byproduct of efficient air conditioning systems. An efficient air conditioning system, by extension, is also one which gives you better indoor air quality. People are also understanding more the drain of an air conditioning system on your energy bill. So, recognizing that when I'm at home using the air condition throughout the entire day because it's hot and I need to work and my kids are here having to homeschool and it's costing me so much money, if I was being more efficient in how I use the air conditioning system, or in my choice of air conditioning system for those who are buying new ones, then of course it means they understand that it would help them to save more. And you always will feel it more and understand the efficiency values more when you use something much more intensely, because at that time, any difference, any significant efficiency difference will be aggregated because of the longer time of use. So I think that there is greater understanding of why it is that you need to have better efficiencies in buildings, especially because of what COVID has done in keeping people indoors and having people seeing the impact of that on their energy bills, at least certainly in the case of homes and so on. There is also on the business side the recognition that they need to improve the bottom line, and there is recognition that improvement of the bottom line comes from improving operations and the cost of operations. And many companies have already recognized that energy cost is a big part of the operations. They realize that in a tight economy, you have to squeeze more out of the dollar. And because of the fact that there's not as much money going around, there's not as much circulating, as I said, the economies in many countries are getting a squeeze. Guyana was the only country to register growth in 2020 in the CARICOM region. Companies are having to do more to keep their bottom lines, and a part of that is being more efficient in the operations, and a critical part of that efficiency comes from energy efficiency. Many hotels, in fact, in the region have already started to implement energy efficiency mechanisms as a coping mechanism to ensure that when they reopen, they are able to make more money on the dollar when the tourists are coming. They see that there's going to be an opportunity for them to get more from each room, if it is that the rooms are more efficient, if it is that the facilities are more efficient. So there is already work going on in many of the countries, in many of the hotels, in the tourism and hotel sector, to improve energy efficiency so that they can save money from the energy costs and that they can improve the amount of money that they make from the sector.
Do you believe the COVID-19 pandemic, the effects of that, and how it has sort of switched some of the not achievements, but the goals many member states had for 2021 to spend on different areas like infrastructure, etc. Do you believe that COVID-19 can or will have an impact, a significant impact in delaying the transition to this pathway that CARICOM envisions for the region?
In terms of the energy pathway, or
yes, the energy pathway.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's natural. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're talking about countries which had tourism sectors that were decimated within a month, a month or less, you had rooms which were at 100% occupancy dropping to almost zero in some countries, and then for the better part of a year, occupancies remain practically zero or very low. Definitely that's going to affect monies that the countries would have. There are many other things that would have been affected in those countries. In some countries, carnival revenues, tourism in general, cruise shipping, trade and commerce in many aspects of their economies went. People were just not doing the same things that they were doing anymore, whether local consumers or international consumers of goods and services. So the economy suffered, and with the economy suffering, naturally, countries do not have a lot of the leverage that they would have been able to utilize, meaning tax dollars and earnings that they would have been able to push into some of those investments, or maybe used to encourage private investments to support some of these areas. So, yeah, it definitely will have an impact. Now, what countries have to, have been doing is looking at ways that they can become smarter. They target the limited amount of cash that they have, or in the way in which they are able to leverage investments through the IFIs, meaning international financial institutions, and multilateral development banks that are supporting them. And so they are looking at where it is that they can get the best bang for the buck from those investments that they will be able to undertake, even within the constraints I wouldn't say post-COVID, but in this period. We have recognized that the energy sector is actually one of the areas that would actually help to the countries to recover stronger because of the, if you want to call it, multiplier effect of energy to other sectors. If you think of it, every single productive sector, every single social sector benefits from cheaper or more cost-effective energy. And that includes energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is probably the cheapest form of energy you have. It's one of the things we always call it. The energy that you do not produce is actually the cheapest energy. They are looking at how it is that we can, use renewable energy and energy efficiency opportunities to not just reduce costs, but also to create green jobs, because this is a new line of work that would not have been there in many instances if we accelerate some of the renewable energy technologies and some of the energy efficiency practices. So we think that it would improve the competitiveness of businesses, and we think that it would improve the disposable income that citizens have if they were to get more cost-effective ways of accessing and using energy. And of course, we expect that this will improve too the job situation in many of the countries, because there will be, if you want to call it, additional jobs created, and good jobs, not just cheap manual labor, but really high value jobs, if you want to call them that. So we do see the energy sector as one of the sectors that could in fact attract a significant amount of recovery, and importantly too, in the way in which energy is configured in most of the countries, energy is really being paid for through US dollars. When the ships turn up in the harbor to drop off, whether diesel, whatever distillates it is, whether it's diesel, whether it's fuel oil, whether it's gasoline, it's hard currency that is required. Guyana dollars can't pay for that. Although the consumers are paying for it in Guyana dollars, whether it's Guy Oil or GPL, whoever is paying for it has to come up with hard dollars. Now, in the case of Guyana, yes, Guyana was one of the fortunate countries who didn't suffer too much from the impacts in terms of its ability to earn US dollars. But the countries which are suffering, like the tourism-centric countries, which are not able to earn US dollars and have to be paying for oil products in US dollars, you can now imagine how it is affecting the balance of payments. So they are recognizing that trying to look to more indigenous sources can improve the balance of payments, and they are beginning to start to try to see how they can accelerate programs so they can reduce the dependence on the imported fuel sources and switch to more indigenous sources so that they can have better balance of payments options. Now, you also want to understand that we are coming from a situation too where last year at the height of the pandemic, the price of oil was at approximately around $30 a barrel because of the low demands. Where is the price of oil today? We're talking about $77 per barrel, and it's creeping up slowly without a lot of people even noticing, but it has been very high in my opinion. $77 a barrel is not something to not take notice of. When countries would have budgeted, especially for the oil importing countries, $50 a barrel approximately for oil, and it's now at $77, they have to find that extra money from somewhere. So that volatility, which countries had become accustomed to, is back. It has always been there, but it is now a bit more noticeable because it's on the high side. When the volatility is on the low side, a lot of people are celebrating or they pretend it doesn't exist. But when the volatility of the pricing gets to the high side, then everybody notices, because then it really starts eating into your bottom line, and countries are taking note again, and they are recognizing that we need to reduce the dependence from the oil, not just because of the fact that it saves you the US currency, but also the volatilities and the unpredictability. Nothing, no business likes when the rug is pulled from under its feet. Suddenly, imagine you plan as a company to spend X amount of money on electricity services in a country where the price of oil is usually passed on through the electricity bills, because there are many countries in the CARICOM region where fuel is simply a pass through in your bill. The utility itself cannot absorb it, because the way the rate structure is set up is that the fuel charge is a pass-through that goes straight to the customer. Now, if you're running a restaurant and you are expecting to pay a certain amount of money in bills because of what you would have been used to over the last couple of years, and then all of a sudden there's this increase in your bills, and it's happening in a period where you are just beginning to recover from COVID after being shut down in a country like Trinidad and Tobago, where many restaurants are just now opening for the first time. You can imagine the impact that will have. So there is a lot of recognition that fixing the energy system in countries can improve the bottom line at the macro level for the governments and at the micro level for citizens and businesses.
Thank you very much. Now, I want to go a bit international. As you're quite aware, I'm sure, there has been a renewed global movement to have this transition to cleaner energy. In fact, the International Energy Agency has proposed the need to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and all nations are being asked to play their role where this is concerned. Do you believe CARICOM's energy policy will help member states to play a role in this regard? And to what extent do you think should be the Caribbean's role where this proposal is concerned?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's always a very good question, because there are contending views about how much the Caribbean should be doing in respect to climate abatement, because of what one could call differentiated responsibilities of actors within the global greenhouse emission space. Well, let me start with the CARICOM energy policy. The CARICOM energy policy was developed in 2012 after around 10 years of work. And it wasn't easy, because you are talking about contending differences and views among, at the time, oil producing and gas producing countries like Trinidad and Tobago, those which were mostly energy importing, and some which of course were small countries like the Eastern Caribbean, smaller countries of the Eastern Caribbean, and larger ones like Jamaica, which had refineries, and so on. So there were many differences in terms of what each country was trying to achieve in its own national domain, and trying to pull all of this together within the context of a regional framework was not easy. So it took around 10 years to get to a compromise position, and of course a common policy that sought to capture, if one could call it, common threads that were applicable to all countries. In 2013, this was approved by ministers, energy ministers of CARICOM, and that has been guiding us for the time being. We have what we call a sustainable energy roadmap and strategy that guides the implementation of the policy. And within the context of that sustainable energy roadmap and strategy, we have targets for renewable energy deployment. The targets that we have currently on the table are 28% renewable power generation. All the power in the region should be generated from renewable sources. 28% of it by 2022, and 47% by 2027. Those are targets aggregated at CARICOM level for all countries. Of course, we have been working with countries again to understand what each country's contribution to those targets could be, because each country's contribution will be differentiated depending on their situation and, of course, size and all the other different things. You would naturally understand that a country like Trinidad and Tobago that has a grid of 2,000 megawatts, its ability to contribute 100% renewable, to implement 100% renewables will be very different from a country like, say, St. Kitts and Nevis, which has a grid which is 57 megawatts. And of course, the ability of a country like Barbados, which has no rivers, has no geothermal sources, and therefore has only opportunities for wind and solar, would be different from a country like, say, St. Lucia, Grenada, or St. Kitts and Nevis, which has geothermal options, which is a nice, steady source of renewables, which will flow throughout the day and throughout the night at the same level, depending on the plant that you build. Something like somewhere like Guyana, where it could be a larger plant and continuously generate power from your rivers. Wind and solar are interesting because they are what we call variable sources, so they go up and down, as you know. There's a cloud, there's no solar anymore. The wind rises and falls. At night, there's no sun also. So there is variability, and so we have to understand what we mean when we're talking about integrating these sources into your system, because it is going to be a part of a mechanism that will require you to put in what we call systems that give you redundancy. Redundancy means backup, if in a sense. So you have to account for any variability, so that if there's a drop, there's something to pick up that drop. And if there's a spike, that something goes away when the spike comes. And we use battery in many instances to do that, which is why we have in the battery in the CARICOM system, because the battery can always produce our save energy. If there's excess, the battery takes it. If there's a drop, the battery pushes out some of what is required to fill. The gas is also a good option to do that, what we call load following, because gas generators can switch on and off like that and can just come in and fill any gaps or turn off whenever you require. So that is something I'm sure we'll talk about when we get to Guyana. But the point is that we have a strategy to put up to 47% renewable energy into the systems aggregatedly across CARICOM countries by 2027. So this energy policy on which this strategy is built is therefore supportive of an integration of renewable energy into the system. So that's the first point. The second point is that CARICOM countries collectively on the climate side account for less than 0.4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, if we look at it in that sense, less than 0.4%. So the question of, differentiated responsibility is one which always comes up in the climate negotiations. We are good stewards. That's why we are doing what we are doing. We recognize there's a value to leading by example and walking the talk. We don't just want to talk. So of course we are good stewards. So we of society, we are good steward, global citizens. So we want to, show the path towards decarbonization. We recognize that we have a lot of renewable options in the Caribbean countries, and we recognize that these renewable options, they also generate what we call an economic benefit to us because of the nature of how our energy systems are configured. We recognize that oil and gas doesn't flow in the majority of CARICOM countries, so therefore renewable energy options which sit in many of the countries would provide indigenous options for us. Additionally, there is what we call the role of diversification. When we were young, they tell you don't put all your eggs in one basket. But you don't want to be dependent on one source of fuel or one source of energy. Imagine what happens when you are dependent on oil imports to run your electricity system or your transport system. And if there's a hurricane in the Gulf And the refineries in Louisiana or the refineries in Mexico, which we typically depend on, oftentimes get affected by and the shipping routes or lanes get clogged for whatever reason. It could cause delays and all of those kind of things. If the hurricane destroys some of your bunkering facilities and some of your port facilities, you can't deliver the fuels. So what would happen in those instances? You could end up with shortages of supply if there are geopolitical issues which results in shortages, all those kind of things. So having indigenous sources that are within your control is important. So having some amount of wind, some amount of solar, mixed along with those fossil-based options which you have is always good. You don't want to have only one type of renewables either, because one type of renewables again is not a diversified source. There's an example next door to us in Venezuela. Venezuela, has 100% of its electricity that is based on hydro sources. In the good times, not even now, I'm not talking about nowadays. In the good times when Venezuela was Venezuela, there was a drought. I think this was about 2016. There was a big drought in Venezuela, and for months, Venezuela faced one of the most severe blackouts in any country in the world, because there was a drought which did not allow the hydropower systems to produce at capacity, and therefore they weren't able to produce enough energy as they were required for their country, simply because they had invested in only one type of power generation system. So you don't want only hydro, because if there's a drought, it could affect you. Or if, let's say, even worse, it could be man-made. If somebody was to blow up the hydro turbine or the dam was to become damaged, then what would happen? If you depend only on solar and battery, then you have a problem. In countries where there is hurricane, if the hurricane comes and destroy and damage a significant amount of the solar, then you have a challenge. If you have a weather system that sits over the country for weeks, like you have sometimes, then cloud cover, your battery might not be able to last it through. So you want to have diversification in your sources and your options, and you also want to have flexibility in how you can use those sources and options available to you. So in that regard, renewable energy is very important for diversification and flexibility, which is what modern systems require. So despite the climate abatement actions that would be derived from renewable energy, CARICOM countries actually have an incentive. We have an incentive to include renewables, because renewables is not just for us to give us clean energy. It also gives us the kind of resilient energy systems that are important in our islanded arrangements that we use for power generation, and also that we use to operate our transport systems. So it's really looking at how to transition to the kind of diversified, flexible, cost-effective energy systems that we need to have a better, a more resilient system. But at the same time, enjoying the benefits of carbon abatement, climate abatement as we do so. So the climate abatement factor, the greenhouse gas emissions, is actually a co-benefit that we enjoy from pursuing an energy strategy that allows us to actually become more resilient and in our approach. So I would therefore say that within the context of the global climate negotiations, CARICOM countries will continue to play a lead. We are part of the Alliance of Small Island States. We have talked about 1.5 to stay alive, which means 1.5 degrees Celsius limits to surface temperatures relative to the pre-industrial era. As we speak, scientists have been reporting that we are about at 1.3 degrees already. So we are pretty close to that 1.5. Countries have, there have been reports produced that says by 2023, countries would need, a lot of countries, the larger countries, most of the industrial countries would need to have peaked their emissions and get to certain amounts of carbon reduction for us to achieve that 1.5. We are going to the Conference of Parties to have these discussions again in November in Edinburgh, and the hope is that we can continue to demonstrate leadership. Many countries in the region are already leaders in renewable energy use and in embracing renewable energy use. Many countries, including Guyana, have talked about moving towards a 100% renewable energy use in power production. Barbados too, I can name probably at least 5 or 6 others. Others are talking about significant amounts of renewable energy. We are talking about electric vehicles that are built on renewable grids. So we expect that we'll continue to play our leadership role. We are going to the COP, which is the Conference of Parties, to continue to press the others to do what is required. We recognize that we alone can't do it. It's a global effort, and our effort, do a drop in the bucket, is good to show that we are continuing to be committed. But more importantly is that renewable energy for us is really what we would call the bedrock of our sustainable development strategy and our resilience strategy. And we are getting climate abatement benefits from that.
But Dr. Gardner, given the contribution that you noted earlier that the entire region makes, it sort of seems quite insignificant from a really global perspective. The reason why I'm just bringing this up again is because would it be safe for one to conclude that even if we do everything that is necessary, it still would not be enough to make that sort of dent or a significant contribution in the everyone playing their role in the lower carbon emissions perspective?
Yeah.
Would that be a safe
it's safe to say that the Caribbean by itself will not be able to keep us to the temperatures that are required to reduce the projected impact of climate that we are trying to avoid. So we need, more concerted efforts from at a global level, and that is why we keep using the UN system through the United Nations framework for climate change convention, because that is where most of those climate negotiations take place. That is where the countries that can actually collectively make a significant difference are, being pressed to do so. And we are hoping that, even by doing our little, we can, and demonstrating that, we are prepared to do what we can in our own space, despite the fact that it's not as significant as some other countries. We hope to get results. They're all is not lost. I mean, China has been making a significant amount of moves in that direction. They have making good overtures. The United States have signaled its Green Deal, and it's moving, talking about moving in that direction. We know Europe has perennially been pushing in that direction. It's really to see how we can get them to accelerate a lot of what they have been talking about, and we think that things are aligned, and we think that a lot of that will perhaps happen, and we as the Caribbean will have to continue pressing, we'll have to continue pushing, and of course forming partnerships so that we can at the same time finance our own systems, because it is important that the resilience of our system is built even as we push our partners to become greener, because the climate has already started changing, as we know. So the resilience of our system to the potential impacts of climate needs to already be built. We can't take it for granted that the climate isn't already affecting our energy systems. So it's twofold for us. On the one hand, we are seeking to get assistance to improve the resilience of our energy systems by diversifying the sources, by rebuilding some of our transmission and distribution systems to make them far more efficient. We don't want to have, in some of these countries, the situations where, there's a hurricane, it cuts one power line, or even in a country like Guyana, if somebody gets drunk one night and knocks down a light pole, half of the country is in darkness because it happens to knock out a feeder that is part of, a central part of the grid. You want to have the kind of network where you have options to route power in multiple ways, so that if you can isolate areas where you have faults and reroute power to those areas where there are no faults, so that this serial arrangement where one fault in one end of the country affects everybody in another end of the country is a thing of the past. So those are some of the resilience measures that we need to look at, looking at what we call embedded microgrids in the urban centers, looking at battery storage, both on the grid and of course distributed in some of the premises that we have for our customers, looking at distributed renewable energy sources in customer premises, and looking at utility scale solar and wind and other types of renewables in various places, and of course where we have central power plants, looking at how we can use some of the more efficient options like gas and so on. So many different things. You're looking at, as we say, more intelligent communication between the grid and the customers. So you end up with two-way flow of energy. You have communications that may eventually manage when it is that certain types of energy use would be accessible to some kinds of customers and so on. Because you could create rate structures that can facilitate some of these things. Some of it is not just technology, some of it is policy innovation, some of it is regulatory innovation. So there are different types of innovations that we need to employ, at the policy level, at the regulatory level, at the financing level. And then, of course, because the technology innovation, I think, is actually proceeding at light speed, because a lot of it, due to climate, is being pushed by those who are seeking to get climate abatement. So we have a lot of technologies now that allow us to do almost anything we want to do if we just pretty much put the innovative policies and regulations and financing to work.
Thank you for that. I want to place this spotlight now on Guyana for a bit. CARICOM has this ambition for us to become more energy efficient, and for us to ensure we efficiently use any fossil fuel or any type of energy source. We have the discovery of over 9 billion barrels of oil equivalent resources, and there is a huge debate as to whether Guyana can have its cake and eat it too. Can we have renewable energy, pursue the efficient use of energy resources while extracting and developing billions of barrels of oil equivalent resources? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think that the two can be done simultaneously. It's a function of management. It's a function of how you structure your energy economy to absorb the two. Let's start with oil and gas. And in the case of oil, oil is not going to disappear overnight, no matter how hard we try. There's a lot of the systems, not just in Guyana. Oil is a global commodity, so oil is not something that, when you speak of it, you limit to what's happening in Guyana. You have to look at oil within a global context. And there is so much investment in the world that is built around oil. And when I say investment, we're talking about power plants, we're talking about factories, we're talking about vehicles and other types of systems that are built on oil, refineries and all of those kind of things, where the investments aren't even close to being amortized. That you would end up with billions and billions of dollars of stranded assets, trillions of dollars of stranded assets globally, if you were to talk about, moving away from the production of oil. And you can imagine what would happen to the global economy if all these assets were to become stranded overnight and no longer remain part of the global financial systems. There are many banks and hedge funds which have money tied up in these things. So for them to continue being solvent, these industries definitely cannot just go away overnight. So the oil has to come from somewhere. And it means that international oil companies are always looking for where are the options to get this oil. So if Guyana was to say, we are not going to develop this oil and we are going to leave it in the ground, they would the international oil companies would simply find somewhere else, and they would bring the oil up from somewhere else and put it into the market. So it's a global marketplace. If you look at it, we have to look at oil within the context of our web. It's a global marketplace that demands a certain volume of oil within any given trading day or any given trading period, and that oil moves. And the oil is usually indifferent to which source it comes from, except then, of course, that some refineries are more suited to certain types of crude than others. But at the end of the day, the global markets, which is why with OPEC and so on here, this is what the world demand is, this is what the supply is, and it's simply a supply-demand dynamic that is there to meet a market need. And yes, while it is that we are seeking to address the demand The demand must be addressed at a global level. It's not at the level of Guyana that the demand should be addressed, because the demand for oil is something that will only be effectively eradicated if it's addressed collectively at a global level, which is why what the work that is happening in the Conference of the Parties at the UNFCCC system within the whole climate abatement conversations around cutting emissions in Germany, in Australia, in China, in Canada, in the US, etc. That is where the demand is really going to be impacted most. That's on the energy side. Now, we must also remember that petroleum, meaning oil, is not simply only an energy product. It's not simply, it doesn't only go into the energy sector. Car tires, 70% of car tires are made from petroleum. Most of the plastic bottles that we use, many of the materials that we use are made from petroleum. So if you there's a term we use called petrochemicals, which means those materials that are those chemical compounds, downstream compounds that are coming from petroleum as the source. This is where the future, I believe, of Guyana's oil will go, as it is going in many countries where, initially a lot of it will go into the energy systems because that's where the immediate demand is. But eventually a lot of it will find its way into the petrochemical industries, because very few of those petrochemical products can be substituted with anything else. And those petrochemical products are not necessarily leading to the kind of carbon emissions that the energy sector did. Problem with fossil fuel is the energy sector. When you use fossil fuel to produce energy, you are burning the hydrocarbon, and when you burn the hydrocarbon, you produce carbon dioxide. That is where the problem is. If you're not burning the hydrocarbon, but you're simply chemically converting it and creating a petrochemical that can be used for other things, if in the fertilizer industry, in the plastic industry, you name it, it's a different story. It's not going to be causing you the same kind of climate challenges as you would have if it is in the energy industry. So the challenge is to figure out, how it is that as we transition, going to a more green economy, that the fossils will find themselves in the downstream petrochemical industries rather than in the energy sector as fuel. That is really the challenge, and that transition is not one that is difficult to happen. So I think that even if the oil exploration and exploitation sector is fully developed, it doesn't take rocket science to shift the aspects of the oil away from the energy sector down into the downstream activities of petrochemicals. But the energy sector will always be there as long as that global demand is there. And so I think the way to address the energy sector is really to address the global demand, which we have to collectively do at the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, as we are now doing. Now, in terms of natural gas, natural gas is one far less, if one could call it, it is less dirty, if you want to call it that. At the end of the day, when you burn natural gas to produce energy, the amount of carbon dioxide that you emit is a fraction of what you would use if you were using fuel oil or diesel. So it is cleaner in that sense. So that's one benefit of natural gas in that regard, in that it allows you to transition to a cleaner fuel, but within an architecture with which your engineers and your power producers are familiar. So because you have to also think about that. You can't just get up overnight and get all the GPL to just move away from something that they know. What a lot of the engineers know is thermal generation. They know to generate power from thermal power plants. They know about all of the thermodynamical formulas. They know about Carnot engine cycles and all the physics related and engineering related to how you deal with thermal generation, meaning generation from combustion, from heat sources. And that is what fossil fuels is. It's a heat source. Whether it's gas or oil, you're burning something to produce energy. Well, used to that. So being able to use gas gives you an opportunity to transition from a more polluting fuel to one which is less polluting, with a transition that is not as, if you want to call it, it's not as disruptive to some of your experts and some of your engineers in your country. So it moves them to something with which they are more familiar, and it gives you time to build the competence and capabilities of your people, your engineers, your competent persons in your electricity sector that would have the capability to operate a lot of the renewable systems that you desire, so that when you start integrating your renewable systems, you would have the competencies and capabilities there. Because if you were to shift too quickly to some of those renewable systems, what would happen is that you would end up with a lot of what we call independent power producers coming in to produce a lot of the power, because a lot of our electric utilities would not have the competence, the core competence available within them to be able to generate the power from some of these renewable systems if we do it too fast. If we do it in a way that is deliberate and manageable, we could build the competence to manage it ourselves and to invest in it ourselves. If we don't do that, we will run the risk of investors coming from overseas with the technology. They are the ones who are going to set up and operate the technologies. We are going to end up paying them for power through the power purchase agreements. So it means that we would still be spending US dollars paying them for the PPA, the technology, through the PPAs that they hold, the power purchase agreements that they hold. So we would not have had the kind of foreign exchange savings that we would want to see if too much of our technology holders are coming from outside. So you really want to try to encourage as much indigenous investments in the sector as possible. And so you want to make it happen over time, not just overnight. And to do so over time, it means you want to prepare both at the technical level and the societal level in terms of those who want to invest, those who have the means of capital, so that they can become familiar, they can understand the opportunities, they can have the absorptive capacity to participate in the market and become part of the solution, so that your citizens are not just simply benefiting from the fact that you have clean energy, but they are also benefiting from the upstream aspect of the clean energy industry by being investors, by being the project developers, by being operators of the projects themselves, and by being the technical experts who are designing and servicing these projects. So that is one thing that the natural gas does. It helps you with the transition on that technical capacity side. But more importantly, what natural gas does is, for those, it also gives you time, because projects are not something that some of the better projects do not happen overnight. Solar, yes, you can do a solar project in 6 months, but then solar is not an optimal project for renewable energy in many countries, and certainly not in Guyana. You see the amount of rainfall days we have in Guyana. You wouldn't be able, if solarizing Guyana would not be a good idea as an example, because you have other options. Why would you want to solarize Guyana when you have hydro and you have bioenergy options and and gas as an example?
You would say gas is more of a preference for Guyana, is more of it's a wide.
It's indigenous. Choice? It's indigenous. If it's yours, it means you're not buying it from somebody else. So it's an indigenous source. So it's yours. It's there. It's not an imported commodity. It's different when it's an imported commodity. So because it's not an imported commodity, the equation changes significantly. That's number one. Number two, as I said, it's far less polluting than the sources that you have now. So you are shifting from a source that you are importing. You are shifting from a source that is more polluting to a source that is that is going to be able to give you more energy security, because it's your source. It's the price is predictable. It's going to be cleaner, and it has the advantage that it allows you to take time to build out some of those base load renewable energy projects like hydro. Hydro projects are not projects which you do overnight. Hydro projects are some of the longest projects to develop, because hydro project requires a lot of studies. It requires a lot of environmental and social impact assessments. Even the construction of hydro projects is something that takes a lot of time. There's a lot of civil works that needs to be done. So a hydro project is not something that's going to happen in 1 year or in 2 years. It will take time. So if we want to go to clean hydropower, which would be much cleaner than the gas, over its lifetime, it is going to require us some amount of time for us to get from where we are to where the hydro project can be fully developed, go through the full layers of the developmental cycle to the point of commissioning and being brought online. That's probably 5-6 years. So in the meantime, what do we do? Sit and wait on the hydropower and use heavy fuel oil? No, you could use the gas to get you to the point where you are able to bring the hydro online. By the time the hydro comes online, you would have had probably demand growth anyway, which would mean that the gas plants can continue operating alongside the hydro when required. Not necessarily all the time, but when required, to give you some of your peaking generation that works alongside with the hydro, or which kicks in whenever you have to maintain a hydro turbine or something of that nature. So it's not that the gas is going to no longer be relevant after the hydro comes on stream, but the gas will now become part of your flexibility, flexible generation options that you could use alongside the hydro to ensure that you are able to provide reliable power whenever required. Now, in the short term, while you're doing all of that, what the gas is also giving you is the ability to integrate some amount of solar and wind, because those are the ones which you could bring on stream quickly. And while I said that solar wouldn't be your project, your large projects of choice, there is a role for small, some small amount of solar, 30 megawatts, 40 megawatts, okay. I wouldn't be investing in 400 or 500 megawatts of solar, but you would want to do that for hydro. So if you're bringing in smaller solar systems, then you could do that very efficiently and very effectively if you have gas. If you want customers to also have the option to produce some amount of solar power in their premises like we are doing at the Secretariat, gas would also allow for that. Because what we have, as I said, is you have these variations in the solar. If rain falls, solar gone. If a big cloud comes over, solar gone. Night or evening falls, solar gone. So when you have the demand and the solar is not there, something has to pick up that demand. When the solar comes back, and the solar is being dispatched preferentially, because we usually allow, based on how we design systems, solar to be dispatched preferentially, because it's usually cheaper. I mean, I'm not sure that it's always going to be cheaper than the gas, but nevertheless, because we want to be clean, we'll dispatch the cleaner one preferentially. When the solar comes back, the gas can shut down easily. It ramps up and down like this. So it really allows the solar to operate optimally, when you have gas in your system, compared to if you don't. If you don't have gas in your system, and you want to have optimal operation of solar, it means you would have to put in expensive lithium-ion battery. Lithium-ion battery is one of the most expensive technologies around at this point in time. So the gas would be a much cheaper alternative. It gives you base load power that allows you to be able to do a lot of your bigger ticket items, and it gives you also ramping power, as we call it, which allows you to ramp up and ramp down according to whether you need to put additional energy to compensate for any drop in solar, or to be able to remove that whenever the solar comes back, etc. And wind, if you decide to put wind in, it's the same principle, that when you wind, the gas can follow your load and pretty much kick in whenever the wind dies, and drop off whenever the wind come back. So it really adds a lot to your system in terms of flexibility.
Thank you very much for that. That was quite a detailed explanation there. We've actually come to the concluding aspect of our program this evening, but before we let you go, I'd like to just ask for your concluding thoughts on the discoveries offshore Guyana. And there have also been some discoveries with our CARICOM sister, Suriname. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to know your thoughts on these two nations and their capacity, their ability to supply the energy needs of the Caribbean. Do you think that there's some strategic opportunities there, given their discoveries, to really make some contributions, significant contributions to the energy needs of the region, and as well your overall thoughts on Guyana's discoveries?
Yeah. So the genesis of the CARICOM energy policy was really along the lines and principles of energy security being a collective responsibility among neighbors. The view being that if it is that we could pool resources in the region, so that all could benefit. Not necessarily equitably, not necessarily equally, but equitably. Equitable and equal are different. So all could benefit equitably, even if not equally. And so we have always operated with that premise, and that was the genesis of the CARICOM energy policy. The CARICOM energy policy promulgates and promotes exploration and exploitation of hydrocarbon resources, and there are many countries in the region that have been doing so. Guyana among them. Belize has been exploring and exploiting opportunities for energy for fossil fuels in its shores. It has a moratorium offshore, but nevertheless it's still has that interest. Barbados has been doing a lot of work offshore. Grenada has been doing a lot of work offshore. Trinidad everybody knows about, and Suriname already. Jamaica has been doing a lot of work offshore. In fact, there's the view that there's up to 4 billion barrels of oil offshore in Jamaica right now that is commercially viable. Bahamas has been doing a lot of work. So there are so many countries who have been doing a lot of work offshore because there's recognition that oil and gas can provide significant value to the economies of the CARICOM region. So we are very happy to see that countries within the region, Guyana and Suriname in particular, have made significant progress in respect to their discoveries, and that they are on the road to monetizing these discoveries. We think it bodes well for the region and the integration movement when it is that our member states do well. The fact is that we live in a community where we celebrate the successes of each other. Within the context of the energy sector of CARICOM as a whole, there is a principle of regional energy security which has been emerging even before the finds in Guyana and Suriname came about. And the principles of regional energy security is one where countries which have traditionally pursued energy security at a national level begin to think of collective energy security at regional level and what that would look like. And we think that the finds within Guyana and Suriname actually improve our ability to achieve collective energy security at CARICOM level, and if other countries in the region were to achieve similar, benefits from their own prospecting and their own explorations, then that would bring us even closer to that holy grail of regional energy security. There is a lot that we are pursuing at the CARICOM level in respect to how countries can cooperate on exploration and exploitation of fossil fuel, deep sea water fossils. There is a working group on oil and gas exploration that is seeking to develop that. To look to see how we can start looking at common contingency programs for oil spill in the event that it were to happen. We saw some of the concerns around the Venezuelan vessel that was offshore in Trinidad a few
that event sparked
months ago.
The creation of that?
No, but it was just a perfect example as to why we need to have those kind of things to respond if it becomes necessary as a collective. We also have within the context of the regional energy security strategy, our eyes and our intent to focus also as we look at the deep sea water hydrocarbon exploration, to look at deep sea water marine options like ocean thermal energy and seawater air conditioning and offshore floating wind. So looking at offshore is not just an oil and gas option, but also renewable option too, because if you think about it, some of these offshore opportunities can support wind opportunities, especially because many of the cities are coastal and actually are closer to the sea than they are to some of the areas where the wind resources are on land, Guyana as a prime example. So collectively, that regional energy security strategy is one that embraces Suriname and Guyana and the availability of oil and gas, in particular gas. We believe that Trinidad, Guyana and Suriname can serve as a cone that supplies natural gas to the entire region. Natural gas in the region would be useful for the reasons I spoke about before, because a lot of the countries, especially those who don't have hydro and geothermal resources, would benefit significantly from natural gas as a baseload source of power, and it would facilitate the ease of them being able to implement and integrate large-scale solar and wind into their systems. Jamaica has already started importing LNG, liquefied natural gas, to do this, and being able to benefit us from natural gas within a regional arrangement as part of the Caribbean single market and economy would be the holy grail. And we definitely are looking to see how we can pursue cooperation on a collective basis around energy security that sees and treats Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname as, if you want to call it, the fulcrum of the sources on which many of the countries will depend, even as they seek to explore and exploit their own indigenous sources of both hydrocarbons and renewable energy options.
And just your thoughts on the discoveries offshore Guyana. They continue to, we still see an aggressive exploration campaign. What are your thoughts on, the discoveries thus far?
Yeah, no surprise. Based on the USGC, United States Geological Surveys, we have always expected that the Guyana Suriname Basin contains significant amounts of resources. So what we are seeing is a realization of those what we would say preliminary assessments, and we think that the studies, the findings bode well for the country. The question, of course, is always ensuring that it contribute the resources that are derived from the sale of oil and gas and the royalties and all the other things will remit to the improvement of the country, the infrastructure and the people resources especially. So investment in infrastructure, investment in the people, and if that is done properly, then there's no stop in Guyana, there's no stop in Suriname, there's no stop in any of the countries in the CARICOM region that would have come upon similar fortunes.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Gardner. This was certainly a very informative discussion. I can, let you know that the guests, the viewers that we have on Facebook Live, they've been very much impressed, and they've been happy with the information that you've provided. So thank you very much for being so detailed with your responses, and we do hope that we can have you back to share your knowledge, your expertise on the work CARICOM has been doing, as well as your perspectives on the energy sector.
Certainly. Thank you very much for having me, and good night all.
No problem. Good evening, everyone, and please continue to stay safe. Remember to practice social distancing, and if you haven't gotten your vaccine as yet, please ensure that you do so. With that being said, do have a good night, everyone.